Drug maker Aspen has paid 6.1 billion rand for Australian-based Sigma Pharmaceuticals. Joining me now on the line from Durban to discuss the deal is Aspen's CEO, Stephen Saad. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining me today. And according to your press release, you say that all conditions precedents have been met to acquire the pharmaceutical business of Sigma Pharmaceuticals. Just speaking to some of the investor community, there's still a bit of confusion as to whether this means it has received regulatory approval from the Australian government.
Yes, it has. I mean, the regulatory approval really were three key areas. The first was the ACCC, which is the sort of competition commission, if you want to call it that, the Reserve Bank equivalent, called the FARB, and the biggest issue really was their shareholders, because the shareholders was the major asset in the business and had to vote. They had to vote to approve the transaction. So yes, what you could say now is that the transaction really has no conditionality at all.
So, Mr. Saad, we can then assume that there were really no challenges when it came to dealing with the Competition Commission in Australia.
I wish. I mean, I think it was in the press towards the end of last year.
Yeah.
The issues, we did have issues with the ACCC, and we had to make certain commitments to divest a certain number of products. It was nothing material, but we had to make commitments. I mean, they raised quite a few issues.
Sigma also today says that revenues will be negatively affected by changes in government pricing of generic medicines. What kind of impact are you expecting down the line? Because pricing models, I'm sure, differ vastly from what we see in Australia to the likes of the developing nations in which you operate.
Agreed. I think that, whether it's a developing country like, say, South Africa or Australia, you face pricing challenges. And I mean, the reality of dealing in pharmaceuticals, you deal with the regulators. So that is a regulator, and pricing of medicines is a key issue. I think for us, the bigger challenge is not the regulators. The bigger challenge for us is to make sure that the cost base within Sigma, the generic cost base, is globally competitive, because that is the key to being successful in our industry. I mean, that there will always be a demand for medicines is a given, that it has to be a quality medicine is generally a given. So, it's really about to ensure sustainability, you need to have your costs right. And certainly our due diligence has reflected that the cost base that we enjoy in Aspen, if we can leverage the same procurement capabilities and manufacturing capabilities we have here, will result in significant cost reductions. So the regulators are an issue, and they always are an issue, but for us the bigger challenge is going to be to achieve the requisite cost.
It's quite interesting when you read, some of the reports by analysts. They keep calling Sigma Pharmaceuticals perhaps slightly more distressed than what your other operations look like in Australia. When you read into what went wrong and what went right with the likes of Sigma, would you say that it really boils down to the cost base, as you alluded to now? Well,
I think that it's hard for me to pass judgment across Sigma, but if you had to look at the history of Sigma was a wholesale operation. And they were traditionally in wholesale, and running a wholesale operation, whether it's in pharmaceuticals or any other business, doesn't mean that you can run a business that requires manufacture, development, and certain sales and marketing. And I think where we had, I think you need to have, the world is a much more competitive place, and if you want to compete with Asia, etc., you need to have a competitive cost base, and that wasn't in Sigma.
Let's just take a look at the overall deal. I mean, worth 900 million Australian dollars, as we mentioned, 6.1 billion rand. It's quite a big chunk out of your market share, or market capitalization rather, 17% or so when it comes to the South African market. What kind of turnover targets have you put in place over the next few years?
In Australia,
yes.
In Australian business. I mean, I think that we would probably be doing, in Australian dollar terms, which is roughly about 7, I think it's 6.7 or something. So we'd be looking sort of in excess of 3 billion rand of turnover.
Looking at your Australian operations, now that you've got more on your stable versus South African operations, could you tell us about the synergies and what kind of synergies will then occur between the two nations?
Okay. So, I mean, I think the Australian business in size is going to be very close to what our South African business does look like. I think the key synergies between the operations are we have a very broad portfolio of products now in Australia, which we never had before. We didn't have the generics, we never had the distribution channel. We're strong in generics in South Africa, we can leverage that. We have numerous consumer products, whether it's infant milk formulas, etc., that we can take from our South African operation into Australia, and we've got similar products in Australia that possibly can come back to South Africa. But I think one of the key things that you should bear in mind, and when we look at this operation, we're looking at it as a strong springboard into Southeast Asia.
Fantastic.
We see lots of opportunity in areas like Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan. Those are all areas that we would access from the Australian base.
So is that what you've got your eye on next?
Yes, we've got operations in there as well, and we're doing really well in another area like Japan. And definitely, that is for us, that's a very, very big growth area in our future. We think that the Aspen model fits well in those type of emerging markets.